And penultimate installment of exploring prayer in the month of Elul. My name is Rabbi Ross Levy. I'm coming to you live from Los Angeles, California, and here in West Hollywood. And over the course of the past couple of weeks, for those who haven't had the opportunity to join us, we've been talking about the different dimensions that go into prayer, particularly prayer within Jewish spaces, within Jewish texts and Jewish liturgy. And the first 2 weeks, the first week we talked about the vertical axis, something I think people are mostly familiar with, looking up, looking out into the universe, all of that good stuff. And in the second week, we talked about the horizontal axis. We talked about sort of that feeling of being surrounded by people, both in your immediate surroundings, whenever you're in a community praying, or however we're coming together as communities in the upcoming weeks for the High Holy Days, or thinking about our wider circles, the people that we connect with across many, many miles and much distance. We also talked about the importance of nature as part of this horizontal axis, and about how connecting with nature and exploring that can be such a powerful avenue for spirituality, for connection, and for finding different modes of strength and resilience and compassion and gratitude that all too often we don't see as much in our world when we're just looking at human society. But today we are moving to a third axis, and as we've sort of established a three-dimensional kind of perspective over the past couple of weeks, I wanted to add actually a fourth dimension, which is time. Before we move any further, please take a look at the song/text sheet that are made available. It should be in the comments section on Facebook. But if you're not on Facebook, go ahead and go to the Kol Ami website, kol-ami.org, and you can find the text sheet so you can follow along with us. But a little bit about this fourth dimension, which is time. And this is something that's so important when you think about prayer, particularly when we think about petitionary prayers, which is the fancy word for prayers that look into the future, that express our hopes for the future. But I think especially in Jewish tradition, there is an immense emphasis also on the past. In the way that our service goes, particularly in the Amidah, the central sort of standing prayer, as it's often called, which is actually a collection of many different blessings and prayers, we begin by calling on the special relationship that the divine had with our ancestors. And this is a common theme that we see throughout Jewish prayer, and any kind of petition being grounded in what happened with those who came before us, and seeking to earn those blessings, to receive those blessings as well. And so in so many ways in Jewish prayer, we're looking to the past as a way of articulating our hopes for the future. So if we take a look at the sheet, let me go ahead and share this. See if we can get, guess not. If we take a look at the sheet, we will see it may look like a mistake, and at first it was because I duplicated the document, but I have the same quote from Abraham Joshua Heschel that I used last week. And I went to go change it to bring in a new text, but I thought it would be interesting to actually add a different dimension, because so much of Jewish prayer, when you think about the prayer book, a lot of it is the same texts. They're solid, you could say canonized, but there are texts that only minorly change. There's a very specific structure and flow to the service in Jewish liturgy. But over the course of time, we come up with different and more creative, not necessarily more creative, but different interpretations for what those texts mean to us today. And using these different lenses, these different dimensions of prayer, I thought we could take a different look at this quote from Abraham Joshua Heschel, who writes, "It is true that a Jew never worships as an isolated individual, but as part of the community of Israel. Yet it is within the heart of every individual that prayer takes place. It is a personal duty and an intimate act which cannot be delegated to either the cantor or to the whole community. We pray with all of Israel, and every one of us by ourselves." And so what I wanted to lift up from that is, last week we were talking about contemporaneous praying with Israel. The idea that as we are sitting there in services or at home or whatever we're doing, that we are in fact connecting with everyone around us, that the prayer is not just happening within us, but that it's being facilitated by the community that we've surrounded ourselves with. But it's also a way of thinking about when we go to pray, that we are also surrounded not just by the contemporaneous Israel, the Israel of here and now and today. And when I use the term Israel, I mean the larger community of the Jewish people, but that we're actually surrounded by the Israel of past generations. That when we go to pray, we hear the voices of our religious ancestors. And I think for many of us, we can connect with that, either those who grew up Jewish and there are certain melodies or certain texts that remind us of these moments and of these people that may be gone now. And those of us who explored and chose Judaism later in life, we still have that connection to this ancestral heritage and to connecting with these words that Jews have been reciting and singing, both in times of joy and in times of sadness, for hundreds and hundreds of years. So with that, we're going to sing our first tune, our first song, which is Olam Chesed Yibaneh. It's a very typical, I guess not typical, but it's a very common hope for the future, I would say. Building a world of chesed, of loving kindness, and a world of love, and a world of peace. And that's a way of, in the sense we're connecting with the history of Israel, but in a lot of ways we're using that to look forward into the future and express our hopes for that. So please, wherever you are, at your desk, at home, working, hanging out with your dog, whatever you might be doing, hum along, sing along. Let's bring some music into this Thursday. Olam chesed yibaneh, yalalai, yalalai, yalalai. 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 I will build this world from love. Yalalai, yalalai, yalalai. And you must build this world from love. Yalalai, yalalai, yalalai. And if we build this world from love, yalalai, 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 then God will build this world from love. Yalalai, yalalai, yalalai. Olam chesed yibaneh, yalalai, yalalai, yalalai. So our next text comes from the Babylonian Talmud, from Tractate Barachot, which means blessings. And in this section, the rabbis of the Talmud are debating how the Jewish prayer cycle was developed and how the prayer services were developed. Now, for a little bit of context, in traditional Jewish community, there are three mandatory prayer services throughout the day during the week. There's Shacharit in the morning service. There's Mincha, the afternoon service, and then there's Mariv, the evening service. And we know historically that certainly Shacharit and Mincha come from the temple sacrifices, the daily sacrifices that were offered in the temple in Jerusalem. But the rabbis living after the destruction of the temple turned the sacrificial service into worship service, the services that we think of now. And they very much mapped on the services that were sort of developing and became a staple of this form of Judaism that came after the destruction of the temple, and they mapped it onto the Torah, onto the early characters that we find, and very much their spiritual ancestors. And so in this passage from Brachot, we read, "It was taught in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, son of Rabbi Hanina. Abraham instituted the morning prayer, as it is stated when Abraham came to look out over Sodom the day after he had prayed on its behalf. And Abraham rose early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord." Moving further into the day, Isaac instituted the afternoon prayer, as it is stated in the Torah, and Isaac went out to converse lasuach in the field toward evening. And lasuach, which means conversation or to talk, the rabbis understood meaning prayer. And conversation means nothing other than prayer, as it is stated, a prayer of the afflicted when he is faint and pours out his complaint, sicho, which is a similar, it is the same root, before God. Clearly, according to the rabbis, Isaac was the first to pray as evening approached at the time of the afternoon prayer. And finally, Jacob instituted the evening prayer, as it is stated, and Jacob encountered the place and he slept there, for the sun had set. The word encounter here, vayifga, means nothing other than prayer, as it is stated, and it brings in another textual example. And I think also perhaps this situation in Genesis 28 we might be a little bit more familiar with from the story of Jacob's dream and the angels or the divine messengers, or however you want to look at it, going up and down on the ladders. A whole nother story and a whole nother text study for a different day. But the reason I wanted to bring this text is because it shows how within the mindset of Jewish prayer, this time dimension, this idea of looking backwards as a way of modeling our present, is so ingrained in what we do, even to the point where all of the services are really built off of these ancestors. And I would add, I wanted to keep the text sheet around 3 pages today, but I would add that on Yom Kippur, we read the story, or coming up in the High Holy Days, we read the story of Hannah. And Hannah is seen as a paradigm for rabbinic prayer. Hannah being the story of a barren woman who prays to God and is eventually granted a child. The child becomes Samuel, a great leader. But the idea is that the way she prays, the way it's described as her praying, is seen as a model for prayer. And so in this way, we're constantly connecting with our past as a way of understanding our present and also giving voice to our hopes for the future. And as a way of expressing this, I wanted to bring this song by the Rivers of Babylon, which I think on the sheet made accessible today. It says Sublime for the people who recorded it, which was what I was most familiar with. So, and I'm embarrassed to say that I only learned after I created the sheet that it was not originally their melody, but in fact came from the Melodians, a Rastafari reggae group in the 1970s. But it comes from Psalm 137 and Psalm 19. Now, this verse from Psalm 19 will be very familiar for many people who have been to Jewish services. Yehu le'ratzoni mefi, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in your sight. And also this Al Naharot Bavel Sham Yashavnu Gam Bachinu, by the rivers of Babylon we sat down and we cried. Now this psalm brings us back into sort of the laments of these exiled Israelites in Babylon. And it's a really important psalm, I would say, in terms of this frame of historical memory, because later in the psalm we get a very, very famous few verses which say, Im eshkachech Yerushalayim tishkach yamini, if I forget you, O Jerusalem, may my right hand wither, depending on how you want to translate it. But it's the idea that even at our most joyous moments, we should remember the sadness and the pain of exile. And so in this way, our history is constantly informing our lives and our present. So with that, we'll go ahead and sing By the Rivers of Babylon. By the rivers of Babylon, where we sat down, and there we wept when we remembered Zion. All the wicked carried us away, captivity required from us a song. How can we sing the eternal song in a strange land? Let's try that again. By the rivers of Babylon, where we sat down, there we wept when we remembered Zion. All the wicked carried us away, captivity required from us the song. How can we sing the eternal song in a strange land? So let the words of our mouth and the meditations of our heart be acceptable in your sight, O God. So let the words of our mouth and the meditations of our heart be acceptable in your sight, O God. And continue with a little bit of poetry. A little bit of poetry from Emily Dickinson, one of my favorite poets, I would say. And here, Emily Dickinson offers an image metaphor for hope. And I think when we shift from the history, the past that is being memorialized and in many ways mythologized by Psalm 137, we use that as a way of praying for the future. And I think hope is one of those most powerful forces that keep people moving forward, that keep people, even despite hard times, despite these periods of metaphorical exile we might find ourselves in, that hope is what continues to bring us forward and brings us into the next day. So Emily Dickinson writes, hope is the thing with feathers. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. I don't even want to give too much to that because I think it's just beautiful, this idea of hope being visualized in this way. So I'll leave everyone to find their own interpretations and connections with that one. Okay, so for our next song, and this is this text, Shema Kolenu, comes from the Daily Amidah, the central sort of collection of blessings and prayers that are the most central part of each service, each of those three services that we were talking about before. And this comes towards the end of the Amidah, where we're hoping that God hears our voice, that the universe, that whoever might be listening hears our voice. And even if maybe we don't believe in a theology where someone is actively listening and responding to us, but that the idea that by us expressing our hopes, by us coming together in community and opening ourselves up in that way, that we're opening up a world of opportunities for ourselves. That, I think nowadays people would say that this is manifesting something, speaking something into being. And that's just really another way of talking about praying for something. It just doesn't, I think, feel as good for many people who come from more restrictive, traditional religious backgrounds. But in a lot of ways, it's the same thing. When we pray for peace, we're hoping that peace comes, and not that we're just relegating it to some powerful force beyond us, but that we're taking it upon ourselves to build that world that we're hoping to see. And so we ask that our prayers are heard. We ask that our voices are heard. I think it's such an important idea to keep a keen ear and to listen and to make sure all voices are heard. And in many ways, this prayer, this piece of liturgy, expresses that beautifully. And so we'll be singing Debbie Friedman's melody for this, and I hope you'll join along. This is one of my favorites. Shema Kolenu Adonai Eloheinu Chus v'rachem aleinu Shema Kolenu Adonai Eloheinu Chus v'rachem aleinu V'kavel v'rachamim uv'ratzon et tefilatenu Ki el shomea tefilot v'tachanunim ata Shema Kolenu Adonai Eloheinu Chus v'rachem aleinu Shema Kolenu Adonai Eloheinu Chus v'rachem aleinu Yalalais Yalalai And as we hope that our voices are heard, we hope that for many things, that there's peace, that we find contentment, not only in our own lives, but in the lives of those that we love. I will be honest with everyone here, whoever may be tuning in. It was hard to put this text sheet together because in many ways, one of the core elements of prayer is looking to the future. But Jewish tradition encourages us also to look into the past, to learn from the past, and to call on the past, whether it's the immediate past, the immediate history, or the more sort of mythological past of our ancient ancestors. And it's this idea that as we're standing in prayer, we're not just standing alone, we're not just standing with the people that are surrounding us in the sanctuary or at home, that we're actually surrounded by generations. We're surrounded by so many people that came before us that built this prayer book, built these dimensions of prayer that we have the opportunity to explore. And so I haven't said this quite explicitly, but something I want to encourage everyone, those who are trying to open themselves to prayer, trying to figure out what it means to pray, is that, at least for me, as you go through a service or as you're in the silent meditation or whatever you might be doing as part of your spiritual practice, jumping between these different dimensions or taking a day or a moment to focus on one of them can really help expand what we think about. It is that manifestation I was talking about earlier. It is that hoping for the future. It's also connecting with your past. It's connecting with the people around you. And next week, little teaser, we'll be talking about connecting with yourself, turning inwards. We've talked a lot about connecting with the world around us. And next week, we're going to sort of go inward, which particularly in the High Holy Days is such an important theme. But it is also, I think, we began with this vertical, very traditional notion of prayer. I think inward is also a very traditional, very commonly known way of praying. So I wanted to end with another prayer for peace, a song for peace. This one's a little bit more upbeat, so I hope you'll sing along, maybe even dance along in your office chairs, wherever you might be. Ojivo Shalom Aleinu. Ojivo Shalom. Oop. That was the wrong one. There we go. Ojivo Shalom Aleinu. Ojivo Shalom Aleinu. Ojivo Shalom Aleinu. Ve'al Kulam. Ojivo Shalom Aleinu. Ojivo Shalom Aleinu. Ojivo Shalom Aleinu. Ve'al Kulam. Salam Aleinu ve'al kol ha'olam. Salam Shalom. Salam Aleinu ve'al kol ha'olam. Salam Shalom. Ojivo Shalom Aleinu. Ojivo Shalom Aleinu. Ojivo Shalom Aleinu ve'al kulam. Ojivo Shalom Aleinu. Ojivo Shalom Aleinu. Ojivo Shalom Aleinu ve'al kulam. Salam Aleinu ve'al kol ha'olam. Salam Shalom. Salam Aleinu ve'al kol ha'olam. Salam Shalom. Ojivo Shalom Aleinu. Ojivo Shalom Aleinu. Ojivo Shalom Aleinu ve'al kulam. Well, thank you for joining us. As a quick reminder, you will see at the bottom of the sheet that all of these songs, or most of these songs, can be found on our High Holy Day playlist. It's a big old playlist of Jewish music. I hope you go check it out. And we'll conclude, as we conclude every week, seeing as this is the month of Elul, with the sounding of the shofar. And I think for this week, when we're thinking about this dimension of time, the call of the shofar is seen as something that resounds throughout history. It is sort of a primordial sound that transcends time. And when we hear the shofar, I want us to think about the historical significance, but more so what the sound of the shofar has called, whether it's our people or whatever culture we come from, has called us to do. The world that we live in now is very much the result, for better or for worse, of the hard work of those who came before us. And so as we hear the sound of the shofar, I hope that we'll think about our past and think about our hopes for the future. Thank you so much for joining me.